I've always been a very Orthodox Mormon, 4 or 5 generations back on both sides. My parents were very steeped in leadership, temple supervisors, bishoprics, ward and stake relief society presidents, and they're very affiliated with the Bruce R. and Amelia McConkie families. Amelia McConkie was Joseph Fielding Smith's daughter. I knew them fairly well because they used to sing my uncle's songs. I had a great uncle who was First Quorum of 70 down the Heartline. So we've always been very, very Orthodox. And of course, I went in a mission in the Central Atlantic states in which we led convert baptisms for the entire world in 1962. So when I came home, I was imbued with this missionary spirit, went into the CES program, loved every minute of it, and it kind of went from there. I went to Church College of New Zealand, where I taught junior high science and British Empire history, and then moved from there to the religion department, which I wished to do. So I wasn't one of these missionaries that had earrings in his ears 2 weeks after returning home. Took this rather seriously, and some good things happened to me in New Zealand, and William E. Barrett essentially hired me on the spot to be the Institute Director for Southern California at USC, or one of those institutes. And I found that to be a challenge. But nevertheless, for much of my career, I was in one-man institutes, and I slowly but surely had to expand my teaching base because I was teaching all these classes myself, and so I do a lot of research and find out stuff. And gradually but surely, I found out things that weren't quite what you learn in the Mormon Sunday school. And so it was a gradual thing, and I don't think I ever had any anger about finding these things out, but I was disappointed that things weren't what they were said to be. I discovered a variation of things, no particular order. When I did my PhD at BYU, I was regarded as half faculty, and they paid for my PhD work. That was in the early 70s. And one of my 4 focuses on the PhD was the history of religion in America. Well, I was a colonial historian, and I began to notice that the first 11 preachers in the Book of Mormon, that is from Enos through Alma 2, sounded awfully like what you would expect to hear if you went to a Second Great Awakening revival, both in terms of doctrines, in style, language, everything. Even King Benjamin's speech was a dead ringer for some of those individuals. So that was kind of a red flag, and I thought, why would this be so similar? But it was. I also made some discoveries that it wasn't quite. One of the big ones was that the 4 foundational visions. My insider's view was the first 4 chapters were insiders, or were about the founding visions of Mormonism. That is the golden plate, golden pots, Moroni story, the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, the priesthood restoration, and the first vision. And I noticed they all had something in common, or I may not have been that impressed. And what they had in common is that they were quite secular in the way they were written up. And they all had this in common. They seemed to be more and more embellished as the story went on in each of those 4 visions. And they became more metaphysical, or more physical. They became more unique, and yes, they became more miraculous. That was a red flag. Had only one of those 4 been that way, I may not have done much with it. But that was a big deal to see that, and then to discover that they really didn't see these things physically, they perceived them. In that era, it was called second sight. It was a secular thing, and so it wasn't quite as impressive. What they said they experienced in the Kirtland Temple behind those veils, he says the eyes of their mind was open. Well, that's quite different than seeing you and me. And they led the people to believe that they were talking to Moses and Jesus and Elijah and what have you behind those pulpits. But I don't think there's anybody there. They perceived that they were there. So that wasn't quite as impressive as we had been led to believe. Same thing with the 76th section where we saw Jesus at the right hand of God. All of that came down that they're perceiving things. They're having a second sight. They're seeing something like a city through a mountain as you'd go into Las Vegas at night and can picture stuff. But they're not actually seeing physical beings or objects. So those 2 things, and just a gradual finding out about different problems. But those were 2 really big ones. Well, it was E.T.A. Hoffman's novel. He did a lot of work with music and was influential in Europe and America. And he had a story called The Golden Pot. And it kind of equates with the golden plates. Now, some people don't see a lot of correlation there, but they have to have read the first 8 vigils or chapters of that story, and it's there. Those motifs are there in chronological order. This is what attracted me, and they were there to me in spades. And it just seems to me that the storyline was already in the environment. This Golden Pot novel came out in January of 1827, and the Smith family began to tell a very similar story in June of 1847. Not 47, 27. So it was already in the environment. That does not mean that that's the only place Joseph Smith had it. The story was in the environment. It was being told. The treasure motifs were there as well. And plus Joseph Smith's own personal experience. You put those all together, and I think you've got at least a case that that story was available to him in some form. But I do not think it was the only source that he used to come up with this angel golden plate story. The treasure motifs, if you have a dream 3 times in one night, you're more likely to get the treasure. Well, you find that in the Golden Pot, but you also find that up in Vermont, where the Smiths lived. And so you find them buying into these German stories. The Whitmers had influence in that. They knew about Lumen Walters as the probable contact point. They knew about these things. They knew about the storyline. So in my book, Insider's View, Restoring Christ, Leaving Mormon Jesus for Gospels Jesus, I get more into that, and I go into more detail and more parallels. I have 25 quotes that are very, very similar between quotes in the Golden Pot and in the Smith family as reflected in my book, Insider's View. Then I have 50 more motifs of the storyline. So I think there's something there for people who want to take a look. Well, back then, the Campbellites believed in a loss of authority and a restoration. They were all looking for some kind of a restoration, and this became kind of natural to Mormonism, and so they embraced that philosophy, and most of them stayed with it. They thought this was the restoration of all things. You know, in order to get someone to believe something, you have to defreeze them. And Mormon missionaries are very good at that. They say, well, your church doesn't have a true priesthood, and there was this great big apostasy, but we have good news for you. There was a restoration through Joseph Smith, and he's restored all these teachings. And they very much wanted to be part of that. They already believed in that kind of thing, and so they embraced it. I wrote my first book on the foundational claims of Mormonism. The first 4 chapters are all about the Book of Mormon, the last half about the 4 foundational visions, and I just found rather serious problems that the Book of Mormon wasn't claiming what it claimed to be, and the 4 foundational visions were not either. And then you morphed on to things like polygamy, and they began to become a bigger item. Joseph Smith's effort to overthrow the United States government became more important. We got more information. And by the way, those 2 chapters are state-of-the-art research in this last book, and I think that becomes important for understanding the Mormon Jesus and the revelations of Jesus as practiced by Joseph Smith, and they are quite problematic. Joseph Smith, the Mormon Jesus is quite radical, has a very different character, a very different personality, compared to the Jesus of the 4 Gospels. And that becomes rather stark and radically observable, especially in the Book of Mormon. Mormons like to say that they have a 5th Gospel and have more information about Jesus, but he's a very different Jesus. And that's what we're talking about here. If Mormons want to remain in their faith and feel comfortable in it, I say fine, just upgrade your Jesus and go back to the 4 Gospels Jesus. When you read the 4 Gospels Jesus, he's more loving. I like his nature better, and you don't have a conflict of who you're going to worship. In the Mormon Jesus, you've got an Old Testament vindictive, harsh God thrown in with a lot of plagiarism in 3rd Nephi, especially where half the verses are right out of the Sermon on the Mount. And so you get a bifurcated Jesus. You get a very kindly, worshipful Jesus, and then you get this Old Testament Jesus. And I think that conflicts Mormons so that they don't really know who really Jesus is. They think he's both ways. That's why Russell Nelson could say in a general conference that Jesus is a conditional God. Now, I think that's confusing, and that contributes to a misunderstanding of the nature of Jesus Christ. And that's part of the problem. Well, I have pancreatic cancer. They've given me up to 12 weeks to live, and I'm starting week 8 of that. Not that they know, but, you know, I have a philosophy degree, and I can argue with the best of them that we really don't know, and so forth and so forth. I just think it'd be a tremendous waste of personality if nothing goes beyond the grave. But it's my religious experiences that lead me to believe that I feel very comfortable that we're moving on to another venue. I look forward to the adventure. I think we have much to learn, but no one knows for certain. But it's been my experience as with a lifetime of Jesus Christ that leads me to believe that we're going to continue on. And so I don't really have any worries about that. I don't now. I haven't for many years. That seems a little strange to people, but that's just the way I am. If you take a look at what Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, what Paul says, what Peter says, and what John says, they're all basically saying, you want to know what Jesus Christ is like? Here's these 9 qualities. And when you take upon that nature within you, you know Jesus Christ. So that's what Jesus Christ is. And he is saying that if you are willing to take a little experiment and not just put your toe in the pond, but jump in, and some people may have trouble jumping in, it tells him that you're serious. And if you're serious, I believe he will be there for you. But you can't play games with Jesus Christ. He knows the score, and you have to genuinely make an effort. He does not believe that you can just know him by a feeling alone. He says over and over again, I'd like you to conduct an experiment. And if you will try this stuff, these 9 qualities, and get the weeds out of your path between me and yourself, and that means that you do, in good faith, you do a little reading in the 4 Gospels, you take it serious, you read what it says, you don't see him through any Mormon lens or general authority, and you're willing to jump in. It's like that judge in the parable where this woman comes to him and says to him, I'd like this gift, and he doesn't pay any attention to her because she's not serious. Well, she does that 2 or 3 times, says, okay, I will be there. And if you are willing to make an experiment and take upon yourself this divine nature, I will be there for you, and here's 4 ways I'll be there for you. You will feel my peace. You'll receive my spirit always. You will receive my peace, which goes beyond all understanding. You will see. My words will come back to you in the very time of your need, in time of temptation, and I will walk with you and guide you and direct you, and you will feel my presence in your life. All I can say is that there's been an inner joy ever since I have done that and tried that experiment. Jesus never says you can know him by a religious feeling alone. And Mormonism is really high on that Moroni 10:4, you can know everything and anything by that feeling. And that is a serious, serious problem that can get you in all kinds of historical difficulties, and has. But that's their main linchpin. It's problematic. But you have to be willing to clear the path out. You must be willing to make an effort. And I think that that's why I believe what I have. There's an inner joy. Can you get along without God in this life? Oh, yes, you can. But you can have Jesus says, I came to have a more abundant life. He doesn't want your life centered around a ward house or a ward building or a church. He wants you to have an abundant, normal, actual life, and this will do it. I think, first of all, read the Gospels, Jesus, read the Gospel of John and the Synoptics. Make an effort to get rid of the weeds between the paths of you and agnosticism. You have to step out into the dark, and the spotlight will follow. Now, there's an exception to that. I counseled inmates repeatedly for 13 years at the Salt Lake County Jail. And they've got 5 or 6 fires to put out. It's not like normal people. You have to come to him. You have to make the first step. But when you got 5 or 6 habitual problems, he will get behind the background and begin to move you in directions. And if you show that much desire, he will be there to guide and direct you. And many of those inmates are simply driven to Christ. They've gone to every grade school counselor, every high school, every psychiatrist, every psychology, their parents, they've worn them out. And they finally find themselves in a 4x8 cells with no help, and they are driven to Christ, as Paul says, to the mind of Christ. They want to do well, but they've got these 4 or 5 habits, and maybe if we clean 3 or 4 of them up, they still got 2 more. That's why the recidivism rate is so great. They mean well, but you have to keep working with them. But he walks the halls of the jails and the prisons of this world. He doesn't just hang out in sanctuaries, chapels, and temples. That's what I found out about my boss. So one of the first things I learned. And I learned they like to tell whoppers. They don't tell you the whole story, but I'm there to help them. And it seemed to work if I trusted him more. I'd read in the paper, oh, I didn't know he did this or that, but I was trying to be for the inmate. And in my second book, I get into experiences I had with Jesus Christ, maybe a couple of dozen. "65 to 70% get so burned when they find out Mormonism isn't what it claims to be that they throw the baby out with the bathwater." I would say to read this current book, Restoring Christ. Isn't that an interesting nomer from a Restoration Church? To get back to the gospel of Jesus, to take a serious look and compare the Mormon Jesus with the gospel Jesus, see it through the eyes of the gospel Jesus, give him a second chance. And I think if you don't let the Mormon interpretation and the Mormon glasses, so to speak, influence you, you will see a different Jesus. And I'm already getting hands full of people that are reevaluating their agnosticism by reading this third book, Leaving Mormon Jesus for Gospel Jesus. And they are readjusting their spiritual interpretation, or they're going to give Christ a second chance. And I'm very happy about that, if they're willing to conduct that experiment. And it is an experiment. Some people may balk at that, but that's what you have to do. You have to swallow your pride a little bit and try it. But you got to do more than put your big toe in. You've got to jump in the pond, and then he will be there. That's why I feel good about Christ giving me an abundant life. The most right thing about Mormonism is it is a way of life. It's a cradle-to-grave thing. It has created a lot of very good people because they haven't bothered to tell them about the Mormon past. And now they're paying a tremendous price for that because they've grown at the expense of not telling the truth, and it bothers Mormons who discover this because of the internet, of what they didn't tell them all this time than what initially happened. They've papered over it in these essays, which they don't want the members to seem to read, which is on LDS Mormon.org, and that's very different approach from what the Community of Christ are LDS. They did not paper over it. They said, We're going to take Joseph Smith by the horns. We're going to see the Mormon Jesus through the Gospels Jesus. We're going to put Christ first and let the chips fall where they may. We're not going to tell our people half-truths. And they are benefiting. They had tremendous initial hits on their roll members, but now they've stabilized and are growing again. They are basically a Protestant church, but I think they've done it the right way. Well, they're a much bigger church than the Community of Christ. They have much more money and much more influence. But I've always said the same thing from my first interview. They need to put Jesus Christ, they need to see their leaders through Jesus Christ and not see Jesus Christ through their leaders. When they do that, they begin to see the real Jesus, and they begin to not noisily broadcast that, but to quietly move in the direction of Jesus Christ. And the Mormon people are faithful enough, they will follow. The internet is driving that engine, and I don't think they're going to do anything because of the money and the influence the church has until they reach a tipping point where it's more in their best interest to tell the whole truth. We're not there and may not be there for 25 years. But as Richard Bushman has said, taking it back somewhat, but I honestly think he believes it, is that the LDS Church can no longer sustain the narrative of what they're telling their missionaries to tell the people. And this is going to create ever-increasing problems with the Mormon community and their goodwill, and even the goodwill among their members. And it's already happening. They don't know what to do. They don't have a very good poker hand, so to speak, but they're still playing it out. They need to do, I think, what is being suggested here is that you simply move to Christ and let the consequence follow. Right now, they're not willing to do that, although they are doing more of that. This good friend of mine at the Mormon MTC, which was recently opened, a new 5-story building, there's very little about Joseph Smith. There's very little about the first vision, and it's all about Jesus Christ. So I think some of those leaders are trying to move the church in this direction, but they hesitate. But this is what they've got to do if they're going to really make a difference long term, in my view. When I went over to Japanese shrines, the guide had a big pinwheel, a circle of life, and the guide starts explaining it, and my gosh, it's the born-again experience of Christianity. It's the enlightenments, the Four Noble Paths, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Paths, and I thought, wow, this is a lot the same. I also found this in Baha'i. Among Indonesia is Muslim, but Baha'i is a Hindu. And they take it seriously. You're either a part of the answer or you're part of the problem. And those people take it seriously. All those dragon plays are about re-emphasizing that. So what am I going to say? Okay, this is me speaking. The right-wing Christianity likes to say Jesus talks more about going to hell than anyone. I have a more liberal, graceful view on his part. It seems to me, and this is me, and it's not my call, it's his, but if you take upon yourself the 9 qualities of Jesus Christ, then in one sense or another, you are taking upon yourself the divine nature. And I like to think that he's going to be generous in his grace with these people. And I don't know that that's his call, but that's what I think, and that's what I hope. And we'll see if it happens. My gosh, if you become a little Christ, yeah, I think you're doing it the hard way, because he's absolutely promised that his way is the right way. I'll give you my spirit. I'll give you my peace. I will bring things to you, remember, in the hour of your temptation, and I will walk with you, and I will give you that abundant life. That's why I'm a Christian. I still am a bit conflicted about a pre-earth life. It answers some questions for me. The nature of the Godhead. The Old Testament, they believed in one God, but they didn't refine it into Trinitarianism and all this. And I see conflicting views in the New Testament. Some of them say they don't. I still do. But to me, that is not as important as the born-again experience, which Jesus says you must accomplish. That's far more important to me than whether God is quite this way or quite that way. I do believe in a resurrection of Jesus Christ. I like that idea. But to me, if there was a great apostasy, if there was a loss of authority, we still have the 4 Gospels, and I think that is enough to get us to where we need to go. It's easier to do it his way, but there may be another way, and he may honor it or he may not. I don't know. I don't want people to think I'm too liberal in that. I have ministers who tell me that these evangelicals are frankly all over the map on some of these issues. Some are more tolerant of this, some are not. Some take the Godhead as the only thing you have to believe. Others say it's a little more nuanced, but it's not a top-tier doctrine. What is a top-tier doctrine is the born-again experience. And Jesus says, very rarely you must be born again. That's one of his few musts. The Mormon Jesus is saying you must do this and must do that. Read the Book of Mormon. It's all over the place. He doesn't allow as much free agency. He's got a prescription for every head of the body, from the head to the toe. He has much more draconian views about end-time violence. Whereas Jesus says, yeah, there's going to be all kinds of violence, but I'm not going to be responsible for it. I'm going to be responsible for saving the Jewish people from extermination. And you get into 3rd Nephi, and he almost takes a delightful Old Testament glee that he's going to destroy these cities, and he tells how he's going to do it, and so forth and so on. You do not get that from the Jesus of the 4 Gospels. It is very, very different. He talks about in 3rd Nephi 9 about the destruction of the Nephite civilization, and he's very much an Old Testament and a New Testament God, and that's why Mormons can come away with not understanding the nature of God, and why they think he is bipolar and is a conditional Jesus. He's not a conditional Jesus, but you get that in spades from 3rd Nephi. And we could talk about 4 or 5 other experiences that make that case that he is a radical Jesus from the 4 Gospel, if you want to get into that a little more. It's in this 3rd book. I have a whole chapter called 2 Different Jesuses. And the first half of the book talks about the 4 Gospels Jesus, and the second half talks about the Mormon Jesus, and they cannot be reconciled in my view, period. It's just too radical. And that's what I want people to see. And if they don't want to change their religion, fine, at least upgrade your Jesus. Because the Jesus of the New Testament, listen, those apostles, they had just as big of biases as Brigham Young. When they went to the Samaritans in, Samaritans in Acts 8, They hated the Samaritans. Jesus sent them out of town to buy supplies because he knew that they couldn't handle it. So he goes in and talks to a woman by the well. He treats her far better than she expects. And he shows her respect. And pretty soon the whole town is there, and Jesus is warming them up for when he gives the Great Commission to all the world to go into the world and teach every creature. Well, I'm telling you, those apostles didn't want to go to Samaritans, and they did not want to go to Gentiles. They were the chosen Jewish people. Jesus is warming them up. And when Jesus says, I want you to go into all the world and teach every creature, they did it. And Philip, one of the apostles, went specifically to the Samaritans who he did not like. And he taught them the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the first black people that joined the church were in Niger in about 38 AD, very early on. Peter did not want to take the Gospels to the Gentiles in Acts 10. And you remember the little experiment where Peter receives a revelation from Jesus, and he shows him a lot of unclean animals, hooved animals in a sheet. And he asked Peter, what do you see? I see a lot of unclean animals, Lord. He says, suppose I called them clean. Then they would be clean. A couple of days later, Cornelius comes and says, I've been sent here as an emissary of the Holy Ghost to receive this message. And Peter connects the dots. And he says something astonishing. God is no respecter of person. I have just learned that. They have as much right to this as anyone else. So Jesus includes, the Mormon Jesus tends to exclude. And now let's move that story to Brigham Young, who is a racist. He calls them niggers in his correspondence. He does not like them. And Jesus, why doesn't Brigham Young get a revelation that Peter and Philip received? He does not. And he does not take that gospel to those certain races, not for his own lifetime, but for the next 10 church presidents until 1978. And so when Heber C. Spencer W. Kimball, who is that 11th president, says, why didn't they get it sooner? He says, I don't know why. Well, there's a real disconnect there, isn't there? On the one hand, Jesus solved the bias by talking to his apostles, go ye into all the creatures, and they did it. In the Mormon Jesus, they stonewall. They don't take it. He's tardy. He's reluctant, and it reveals his character and his personality, and it's not very good. So there's another major difference as to why you get a different character, a different Jesus, his personality. And I think one reason you get the reluctant Jesus in Book of Mormon is because black is not beautiful in the Book of Mormon. It's white and delightsome all the way, and they've received a sore curse of a black skin. And I think that's an ongoing problem with Mormon racism. It's embedded directly into the Mormon Jesus. They cannot run away with it. It's a standard work. And we could talk about a dozen of those kind of issues. So we've talked about 4 or 5 of them already in a superficial way. I look back with great fondness of what they did for me. I do not denigrate that. I appreciate what they did for me in my youth to keep me goal-oriented, to keep me oriented on the right track morally. I think they did a very good job, and that is still their best thing. A sense of community where you can have a social knit group who can reinforce that you should be a good person. That is by far to me the strongest suit, and they do it as well as any other religion. I think fortunately the millennials just want to know. They don't want to defend it. They simply want to know what the truth is, and they're doing so. But in recent years, we find out more about Joseph Smith trying to overthrow the United States government, and it's there in spades in 3rd Nephi. It's there in the Doctrine and Covenants, this harsh God. It's in 3rd Nephi when he virtually destroys the Nephite civilization. It's not a winning combination, and it's pretty serious. He's a radically different Jesus, and people that don't see that refuse to take a serious look. So I'd say take a serious look about polygamy. Joseph Smith is into, the Mormon people know he's into plural marriage. They know he's into polyandry. They do not know that what preceded this is concubinage, but it's a different kind of concubinage than you find among Jacob and Abraham in the Old Testament. They had commitments. Joseph Smith shows zero commitment to his concubines, and I think it morphs some concubines into plural wives. The Mormon leaders don't like to talk about concubines because it became so negative. So they lumped them all as honorable wives. That's why Mormons don't know about Joseph Smith and his concubines. But he says, I had a spiritual wife system. And people thought, well, this is John C. Bennett, his counselor, and William Smith, his brother apostle, that was responsible for that. But they're inaccurate because Joseph Smith and Brigham Young continued that very phrase, spiritual wife system or spiritual wives-ism or spiritual wiveries, long after Bennett was excommunicated in 42 and left the community. They saw this as different classes of women. And at least you had concubines, and at least you had plural wives, maybe polyandrous. And another way you can see this is that I have 7 examples that I provide that I clearly think are either affairs or concubines. They are not wives. How do we know they're not wives? Because a wife to Joseph Smith, a concubine to Joseph Smith was not just a mistress. He had to get a revelation that it was okay to have extramarital sex with women, and then he had to ask for her consent. If she did so, she became his concubine. So it's not just a mistress, it's a revelation with a consent. I have 7 examples of that. A marriage, a plural marriage, is much, much a deeper commitment. You have to have the priesthood, you have to have a ceremony, you have to have his permission, you have to have witnesses, and he puts it at the apex of his theology and doctrine. You cannot get into heaven in the top tier of the celestial kingdom during the 19th century, according to Joseph Smith, unless you are practicing plural marriage to get into that higher kingdom. If you accept him, you go to that heaven, and all your kin sometimes get grandfathered in, which goes against the Mormon concept of exaltation, in my view. If you turn him down, your whole family can go to hell. That's why Helen Mark Kimball, who was 14, By the way, there were 3 14-year-olds, and they felt the responsibility for their own family. That's how you know the difference between a concubine and a full-blown commitment to plural marriage. It's a much deeper commitment. The other way you do it is through study and evaluation, and that's what I've done, and I provided 7 examples. And when Joseph Smith stands up in that Nauvoo grove of trees, and he owns that philosophy, and he says, if you don't have any accusers, I will take you into heaven on my back. If people don't know what you're sinning, it's not sin. Mormon people would turn over in their graves and wipe their foreheads about that today, but some of them seem to give him a pass, like he's a special case. But he is simply saying that I don't believe that what people call sin is sin. It's out in the public sermons, and he says, if you will not accuse me, I will not accuse you, and we'll all go to heaven on my back. But I'm going to break sin down, and this stuff is not sin. So when these cases begin to bubble up in the Nauvoo City Council, they excommunicate quite a few people for practicing this philosophy, this spiritual wife system. But you know who's not on the list? Joseph Smith and the Smith family members who are imbibing in this, such as William Smith. John C. Bennett gets thrown under the bus, and a dozen others. He bought and owned that philosophy. So there's 2 ways to make the case of what he's doing. Now, if you switch to what he's doing, what is in 3rd Nephi in spades, 16, 20, 21, Mormon 5, he believes that this land belongs to Whitey, Johnny Gentile. And the only way he can be spared is if he accepts and joins with the Lamanite people, which the flyleaf of the Book of Mormon says is written for a remnant of those people. And yet today we can't find any true Lamanites. They don't even know who they are. The church calls them the people of Lehi. But this is who the book is written for, so that they can repent, and we don't know who they are. It's a serious problem. Or the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament that says that polygamy is required. He never commanded a king or a prophet to ever practice concubinage, polygamy, or polyandry. Joseph goes on, nor is it in the Book of Mormon. So where is it at? It's in Smith's section 132. And people get all upset if you don't get married in the temple because you're not going to have a spouse. Why do we believe him? Why did I not see this as an institute director for the church for 34 years? But you hear people just are terribly upset because you're not going to be with your family. Well, I talk to a lot of ministers, and they believe they're going to be with their families. They just don't know the nature of that relationship. But why Mormons believe that you have to be in that condition to have a family in the next world boggles my mind. In fact, Jesus and Paul and the Old Testament say you don't even have to be married, period, to go to the city of God. It comes from the forces of his day. They're not Christian, but the Cochranites believe that you can secure eternal relationships and friendships in this life. Jason Cochrane thought that he could dissolve marriages. He had some kind of a sealing power to bind or loose. That power was visited upon Joseph Smith 4 months after the perfectionist Joshua, the Jewish minister, had the same view that he could dissolve marriage. He could have a woman's first spiritual child. So the John Humphrey Noyes believes that you can have sex with married women. That's all in the background of Joseph Smith's background. He buys into it, he's influenced by it, and he starts his own experimentations, like Anley with the economic experiences and with the marital experimentation. So Christians are anathema to that idea, but it's in the environment. He picks up on it. He thinks he's going to restore all things. They think it needs to come back, so he puts it in. That's one strong influence. Oh, and he believes in the restitution of all things. But why would God restore a custom? Not a doctrine, but a custom. And by the way, those Old Testament relationships and polygamy were, quite frankly, a disaster. There's no real success stories. So you put it all together and you just think Section 132 ought to be dropped from the Doctrine and Covenants, and they ought to get back to just saying, okay, you'll be together. But we don't know the exact relationship of that, nor is it spelled out, and so forth and so on. But this sealing power goes to his head, and he tells these women, you either do this or you're in big trouble. He gives them 24 hours notice to accept him. He's asked them, do you think I'm a prophet of God? If so, you'll get married to me. He sends their male counterparts on mission and marries them. I mean, it's about 7 things. If they turn him down and go public, he calls them whores, every single one. I've got 8 examples in Mormon newspapers, journals, that he calls them whores. He has no respect for 6 of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not bear false witness to your neighbor. He's clearly doing that. He is committing adultery. There's some circumstantial allegations, but the rest of it is adultery. His own wife says he commits adultery and plural wives. And she knows about some of these liaison, and she kind of winks at it. In 2015, the church actually released the actual minutes of the Council of 50 in Nauvoo, Illinois. 17 meetings. Joseph appointed 50 men, 50 cells, and these men were to help him overthrow the United States government. And they believed it would happen in a very short years. And so they'd set up cells. And I've got 3 examples where Joseph Smith is seeking to get the cooperation of the Indians, the conversion of the Indians, and when there's enough of them, they're to declare war on the United States government and overthrow the government. That is bordered on treasons, and I wrote an article on it in 2012, but when the church put the minutes out, it is a fact set in cement. They cannot run away from this. It is just what it is. Now they do other things. They're looking to get out of the United States. They send delegations up to Wisconsin, who's not yet a part of the United States. They send them to Oregon and California and Texas and the Great Basin. None of them are yet part of the United States. They know they cannot practice overthrow of the government and their independent political theocratic kingdom unless they're outside the government. So they come to Utah, and what is it, 2 years later they're annexed into the United States, and they become a territory and what have you. You cannot understand 19th century Mormon history, period. And that's a big statement, unless you understand those 17 meetings that Joseph Smith conducted. And they were extremely secret. You reveal that, you were beheaded. And Sidney Rigdon said it was treason, and it is treason. And those Nauvoo Legion members who had an army and a population bigger than Chicago in 1845, they could have been executed for carrying this out. That's why William Law's brother, Wilson, was the highest ranking general under Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, and he saw the light and says, I'm not going to do this. They were bringing cannon in and weapons and all kinds of ammunition, and they planned to use it. They were powwowing with the Indians in the in the Nauvoo area. That's one of my 3 examples. Another in the Cherokee Reserve Nations of Kansas and Missouri, and another in the whole territory of Texas, from the Arkansas River clear to the Colorado River. It was extensive. They contacted every tribe they could, and they want them on board, and they want to get a foothold and either convert them, and if not that, create an alliance to physically overthrow the United States of America. And up in Kansas, they believe that they can overthrow Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in 6 hours. This is not just a theory. They are seeking to do this in a very real way. You have to read the chapter on, did Joseph Smith commit treason in his quest for political empire in 1844, but it's there in spades. It's a cutting edge piece of research, as is the concubine polygamy, polyandry, and it's dynamite. It's what's new. And you don't come away all excited about the Mormon Jesus. He's very, very different. And people that refuse to see that have their heads in the sand in a major, major way. It comes from a revelation. John Taylor wrote it. It says, you cannot get into heaven without the permission of Joseph Smith. Brigham Young not only made chronicles that Joseph Smith was made king of the earth and a god, but he had to say who got in. In fact, he went so far as to say that Joseph Smith is the God of the spirit world. You will not get out of it into the celestial kingdom without his permission. And then section 135 just plainly says, you don't get in without Joseph's permission. So it was a little bit of a development, but very much believed by the Mormon people. They used to call Joseph Smith our prophet, seer, revelator, and God. And this is what's upset William and Jane Law. They did not like this kingdom within the United States government. They did not like the immoral proposals to his own wife and others. And they did not like his murdering his enemies, which he went after Emma. He went after Boggs. Smith believed that if you were innocent blood, it was okay to take him out. That's the whole basis of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And John Taylor goes out of his way in section 135 to say 5 times that Joseph and Hiram Smith were innocent blood. They were not guilty blood like Boggs, who interfered and kicked the Mormons out of Missouri. Smith held that grudge, and he sent Orrin Porter Rockwell to take him out. He failed. And then he hired Joseph Jackson to do the job. But he kept encouraging Jackson to take him out. Why? Because he's not innocent blood, and he did it like the calm as if you're going to go buy an ice cream cone. This is serious stuff. The plan is to overthrow the United States government. They already see Joseph. They're running him for president. They already see him as going to win the election, which was announced in March of '45 back in those days, and pro tem of the world government. They're very ambitious. They send a great big letter to Queen Victoria and all the heads of Europe saying, there's only one standard, one kingdom, And you would do well to come over here and join it, because you are in a bogus kingdom. They're very, very bold. You cannot understand what happened in the Great Basin Kingdom in the 19th century unless you understand this backdrop. And in parts of that history, the Council of 50 was a ghost government, and they ratified every piece of legislation that the elected officials, which is a one-party system, put through the Utah territory of Deseret. It's that integral into understanding Mormon politics. Polygamy is the face of it, but it's this political kingdom within the theocratic political kingdom started by Joseph Smith as to what the federal government is really against. If you don't understand that, you don't understand Mormon history in the 19th century, period. In May of 43, she finally finds out that Joseph Smith is already married 21 wives, and she's not one of them. Now, she discovered Fanny Alger, and she discovered one or two others. So if she knew about it, she forgave him or put it on the back burner. But she didn't know, nor did William Law know until May of 1843. So William Clayton, he's chronicling the conversation between Emma and Joseph, and it goes like this. Joseph, if you can have all these wives, I at least want a substitute, because you're gone with him day and night. He marries these 30, 40 women in 18 months. You have to be pretty charisma to do that, and you have to know a lot of women. He pulls it off. Emma says it's not a marriage swap. Get that out of your mind. It's a substitute sex partner. And she's saying to Joseph Smith, and William Clayton, his chief scribe, has written it down in the William Clayton papers, which they have not released. I expect them to release it. It's 4 volumes on the subject. He's the backbone of Nauvoo history. There's another volume in Utah and another volume in his family, but those 3.5 volumes are extremely important. They don't want to release it, but it's in there. And basically it goes like this. If you can do it, I can do it. And I want your counselor, William Law, because he's such a cute little man. If you read section 132, verse 51 and 54, it's addressing this subject. And Joseph, God supposedly makes Joseph and Emma an offer, revelation, that it's okay with them if Emma goes through with this substitute sex partner to placate Joseph, to let him have free access to his 7 women that are living in the mansion house now, which is kind of a hotel house, if she'll treat them well and leave them alone. That's the arrangement offer. Well, they try it out on the laws, and they said, no way. So then Joseph comes back, and you can read it in verses 52, 53, and 54. Oh, I was just testing you like Abraham. But Emma, you are not to do this, and if you do, you will be destroyed. And she clearly took that to mean she would be killed. Just like Boggs had an attempt on his life, and other people. And that's the Mountain Meadow Massacre. They're not innocent blood. Before that, it was the Danites. But this is what's driving this engine, and it goes to his head. And he tells them, I can do anything I want. When he approaches Nancy Rigdon, he has a little different take on it. She's one of his 7 concubines, whatever. And he says to her, look, I'm really smitten with you. This is the first counselor, Sidney Rigdon's wife. daughter. And he says to her, he says, look, I'll take you in any way, shape, or form. It's okay with God. I will either marry you privately or you can be my concubine, but you're free to marry anybody else you want. That's how bad he wants her. It's right there. So this power goes to his head. He thinks he can do anything. This is my take on it. And he uses it to procure either concubines or plural wives. And he does it at the same time. Whatever will work, will work. He starts out with concubines, and he morphs into polyandrous, 2 marriages, and then he comes back to concubines. If he can get them in the sack with concubines, that's good. If he can't, he will marry them, because there's certain kind of women that he can't get, according to some of the testimonials by Orson Pratt's, the apostle's wife, and others. So he's doing both at the same time, but this is the driver, that he has the keys. He can bind, he can seal, he can unbind, and he can unseal, and he's getting that idea from his environment, but it's not Christian. I would call it fabulous week for the following 2-3 reasons. We planned this 8 months ago, and I didn't know if I was going to make it because I'm in the last throes here, doing as well as I can. But 3 things happened up there that put a big smile on my face. The first was that my family has differences in politics, current politics. We also have different in religious views, but I can honestly say that love has transcended that. They're mature enough, and that makes this grandfather very, very happy. I have no complaints about it. The second thing is that I got to talk during that week to every single one of my children, at least twice. It was a love fest, frankly, and I got to find out where they're at, where they're going, and I felt extremely good about all of them, 27 of us up there in a big log cabin. And some families don't even speak to each other, as you know. I haven't talked to the sister for 3 years, all that. None of that. And what I saw when we went to the beach 2 days is that my 4 children, the grandchildren helped each of the 4 children blow up rafts and not be irritated. They had enough outdoorsy that they didn't feel. But I felt extremely good about that. It's like they liked each other and they were a family. So I call it an awesome week. And I came away thinking, I can give a good report to my first wife in every way, shape, or form. And so I call it a fabulous week. Some of them don't believe in an afterlife too much. Some of them are deists. But I've tried to tell them why I'm a Christian and why I feel an inner joy for doing it. And you can get by with that, but try the experiment and your life will be more abundant. That's my testimony to them. I hope they'll do it. I don't know that they will do it, but that's my hope. Try the experiment, swallow your pride, and just do it. Well, you can rationalize it away. I'm not going to rationalize it away, but many of them just dip their toe in and say, well, it didn't work. You have to jump in. You have to take the experiment seriously. And then when you take a step in the dark, the spotlight follows. That's the best way I know how to explain it. And it doesn't work for a majority of people. They've been burned and they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I have no desire to save the Mormon Jesus. I do think it's worth taking a second look at the Jesus of the Gospels. And we're getting some success. We may have hit a raw nerve. It'll take about a year for this last book to make that determination. And I expect mixed results. I don't expect some panacea where, oh, gee, everybody's turning. But some people say, well, it's caused me to reevaluate my spirituality, not necessarily Christ. But to me, that's a good thing. So, yeah. So my 3 books, the first book was a popular bestseller, and it unfroze people from the Mormon way of thinking, as we mentioned at the outset, that you have to unfreeze people before you can refreeze them in your model. And Mormonism does that by saying, no priesthood apostasy, but the good news is that Smith restored it. That is following that process to a T. And I've done that with my book. I'm saying, no, I've unfrozen you from Mormonism, for those of you who are willing to listen. But we have Jesus. You don't need to refreeze it into a restoration. The second book is quite devotional, and I outline what I think the real Jesus of the New Testament is like. And the third book, Restoring Christ, leaving Mormon Jesus for gospel Jesus, is to get people, that 65, 70% who threw everything out because they've been burned terribly, to at least take a second of the look, a serious look at the gospel Jesus. There are many who will not, but some are doing so, and in a year we'll know if that has hit a raw nerve. I hope it has, but I have no way of knowing. So those 3, I got to the point that, well, I can denigrate Mormonism, but I've moved on from that. I want more. I want them to take a second serious look at the Jesus of the Gospels. And we'll find out to what degree that occurs. Every day I get people says I've changed their life. Every single day. I put a lot of those statements up among my papers at the University of Utah Special Collection, but they've had tributes on me. I've got books filled with this. It was, quite frankly, surprising. You don't know what to expect when you write a book. This has been humbling to me. It's emotional because it's so extensive. I never dreamed in my wildest dreams this would be the case, but they come in every single day, and they have for years upon years. So you gotta gather up the emails, you gather up the snail mails, you gather up the tribute statements and the social media, and we're talking into the thousands here. I did not take high school seriously. I came out of that spiral. They had me convinced I was stupid. They did a series of tests at Olympus High School. They tested you for 3 days on everything you can imagine, sat down with you and says, well, we think you should be a cheese wrapper. You know, wrapping cheese. So when I was in New Zealand teaching, I found out they wrap the plastic, then they put it in boxes and run the duct tape over it. Two things gave me hope. One is that my cousin, who had many of the same classes I did, says, it gripes me, Grant, that you study and get a C-. No, I study and get a C-, and you don't study and you get a C-. So I knew that I had something in there beyond cheese wrapping. I told my brother he would be an assistant refrigerator mechanic. That didn't do anything for good for him. But here's the kicker that made my week one day. I was visiting my parents from California as the institute director. I was just finishing up my PhD in ancient American colonial and American history. And the people on the other end were from Olympus High School, following up on the tests that were made as a high school freshman. And they said, we were just wondering how Grant turned out. And my mother got to say, he's just finishing up his PhD in American history. And there's this long pause on the other end of the phone. He says, we're finding that those tests had almost no correlation between success and our tests. And you didn't think that made my day and made my mother's day? It did. So I had a problem. I really did have a problem. Margaret Evans at Olympus High School gave me as a D, as a gift, D-, so that I could pass high school. But I persisted and I overcame it, and I've become a pretty good writer. So I've overcome that problem. So I wish I had become a better student sooner, because I had to go up to the U and struggle. But I overcame that problem. If I had another thing to name, it would probably be just to take it a little more serious. My uncle used to say, life is so serious, you can't take it too seriously. I did not do that. I made a mistake. But I did take Abraham Lincoln, I used to have it on my wall. He says, I will prepare now and take my chances when the opportunity arrives. So I took tough classes at college, and that has paid off for me. And I seem to have the kind of experiences that molded me to be the kind of person I am, to be able to do what I've been able to do. At least that's my take on it. I counsel a lot of inmates that considered suicide. They don't think it's worth living. But the only thing I could ever say that I thought really resonated with them is the people that I know who stayed with it, they're glad they didn't do it. That's one thing. Secondly, I remember one of the best speeches that Winston Churchill ever gave, and it lasted about 2 minutes. The first minute was during the Cold War, and he said, the first minute he just stood up there in front of these cadets or people or whoever he was talking to. He didn't say one word. He just getting their attention. And finally he said this, never, ever, then he paused. He's really hooking them. And then he, 20 seconds later, ever, 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 ever give up, and sat down. That speech had as much impact as any speech this man ever gave, and it was under 2 minutes. And I can endorse that. Life gets better. Suicides have told me, I'm so glad I didn't commit suicide, and boy, I had no reason to live, and so forth. Now, beyond that, I think you just have to have a hope that what Jesus Christ is saying is true, and don't give up on it for a while. Now, some people do give up. They only dip their toe and leave. But if you can swallow a little bit of pride, take a step in the spotlight, I have found He is there, and the joy will be there. You can't explain it to someone. It is just there, and it makes life bearable. More abundant is the word He used. And I think it's true, and that's why I am hopeful going forward. Whereas if I wear my philosophy hat, we don't know. I have friends who say it's all going dark. And if it goes dark, then I won't know either way, will I? If something happens, I will be joyous. That's the philosophy hat. The religious hat, I've had enough experiences with Him one experience that goes beyond the regular feeling, dream, vision thing, and that has helped anchor me. But more important is what I'm saying. So just stay with it. Don't give up. I could tell a story of an inmate that's at the last of the second book. This man had spent most of his time in a lockup. His mother was blind and had 8 different foster children, of which he is one. He'd run away from home numerous times, was in foster homes. He had 6 or 8 bad habits. You and I might have 1 or 2. That's a big difference. They'd gone through the juvie system, all the counseling, and yet it didn't take. So there they are in lockup. So I go to help him. We spend 9 months on this guy. We put out 3 or 4 of his 6 fires. Get him a job as a short order cook. He's back 3 months later. Not a success story. He doesn't want to look me up because he's embarrassed that he disappointed me, God, and himself. But he actually got to the point where he believed in himself, but didn't want to talk about it. I found him in the jail one day, and he says, I just can't do this. I put my arm around him. I says, I've observed my boss. I said, we'll start over again. And he said to me, we'll start over again? And he wept. See, I'd learned something from Jesus. He does walk the halls and the prisons of this world. He knows exactly what he's doing with those kind of people. And they seek the mind of Christ because they have nowhere else to go. The parents are thrown in the towel. So you stay with it. And then I said this little speech, and that's how I closed Book 2, The Incomparable Jesus. I says, you know, the marvelous thing about Jesus, you don't have to win the gold, silver, or bronze medal. You don't have to be one of the first million across the line, the finish line. But what you do have to do, you have to cross the finish line. And in your case, I think you're going to cross it crawling in the dirt on your hands and knees. But he will say to you when you do, my good and faithful servant, enter into the rest of the Lord. And I believe that. So don't ever give up. You're going to have some very bad days. We all have. It's part of the territory. But it's worth it. In 2 months, I'm not going to have this Treblinka World War II body. I'm not going to be a little yellow old man because it's rubbing up against the liver. I'm going to be younger and have more stamina, and I'm looking forward to it. We're going to learn a lot, and I think we have a lot to learn. And so I'm very positive. I have been for years. Some people think I have courage. I don't have courage. This is the way I've always been. I could tell you stories about that. So they think it's courage in a world that doesn't seem to have much integrity. To me, it's just who I am.